Hey, today I want to talk to you about emotions. Emotions are these wonderful gifts from God to us. I want you to think as we go through this presentation, I want you to think of the most difficult things that have ever happened in your life, maybe the most painful times. Maybe it was a great loss, or maybe it was some great physical trouble that you've gone through, relational trouble. And I want you to think of the emotions that were connected to it. And then I want you to think of the most joyous thing in your life, the most hopeful, the most encouraging thing that has ever happened to you. And I want you to think of the emotions that were connected to it. And what we're going to find is that some of the greatest struggles and also the greatest joys in our lives are connected to emotions. Emotions are these gifts from God that are built into all of humanity. And we have them in all cultures by God's design, that when God created humanity, he created humanity in his own image. And he wired within every single one of us, and he's knit us in our mother's womb. And emotions were built into us. Emotions are physiological experiences that move us into action. They draw us to do things. And emotions are also producing of some of the greatest joys in your life. Some of the greatest excitements in your life are connected to emotions. But also some of the greatest struggles and agonies as well are connected to emotions. But the dilemma with emotions, as wonderful as they are, as wonderful gifts as they are from God, they are often twisted by sin. And we can't be absolutely certain that the emotions that we're feeling are accurate. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they had feelings, a series of feelings connected to sin, shame and fear and guilt. In Jeremiah, it tells us that our hearts are deceptive and desperately sick. Who can know them? And that's why we need the gospel. The gospel, and it's only through the gospel that God has redeemed us from the curse of the law. It's also through the gospel that he's redeemed us from the curse of sin. And it's that where we can find freedom. In Genesis chapter 4, if you get a chance to read it, you're going to hear a story of Cain and Abel. And Cain was so overwhelmed with his emotions, and God was so gracious to him, and he says, Cain, why are you downcast? Don't you know if you do what is right, won't you be lifted up? Well, Cain needed the gospel. He needed the good news. He needed to come in humility, faith, and prayer, and that's how he could have brought the emotions under control if he brought them to God, but he chose not to, and it brought great destruction. And that should be a great warning for us as well. I want you to think of this. How do we interpret things? That when an event comes into your life, what do you have a tendency to do? You tend to respond to that event. And then what we tend to do in our communication with other people is we say that event or that circumstance or that person made me do what I did. So you made me angry. You made me yell. You made me lie to you. You made me respond to the way I did towards you. But the reality is that it's not the event that causes the response. It's how we interpret the event. See, the interpretation of the event makes such a difference. You take two people going through the exact same event. Why do they have two different responses? Because they have two different interpretations. So how you interpret events is so important. And that's why this quote is real essential, that if what we perceive or choose to believe does not reflect truth, then how we feel does not reflect reality. Let's go over that one more time. If what we perceive, that's what you believe or choose to believe, does not reflect truth, then how you feel does not reflect reality. So let me give you a common situation. So I'm at church on Sunday, and there's my good friend over in the corner, and I see him look my direction, and then he turns away from me. Now I interpret that he is now talking about me to this other person. And then I further interpret that he took something I shared with him earlier this week, and now he is sharing that with this person. Well, what happens if my interpretation was wrong? What happens if my perception or my belief was wrong? The feelings I would have would not be based on reality. But the feelings I probably would have. I'd probably be angry and frustrated and sad and irritated and embarrassed, whatever it is. But all of those feelings, which were real feelings, were not based on reality. because my friend wasn't talking about me. My friend didn't even notice that I was there. He looked my direction, but he didn't see me. But it was all based on the feelings I would have been based on my faulty perception. And so that's why Jay Adams said that our problem is not emotional, but pre-emotional. And what he meant by that was this, that the emotions that we have are, I like using the illustration, think of it this way, like a light on the dashboard of your car. The light on your dashboard comes on and it says the gas light's on. Well, what does that mean? Unless there's a problem with the mechanism of your car, it just means you need gas. So you go to the gas station, you put gas in the car, and guess what? The light goes out. And here in the Northeast, when it gets cold, oftentimes the air pressure in our tires diminishes. And so what do? Oftentimes the light on the dashboard will come on for the tire pressure light. So you go and put air in the tire, and guess what? The light goes out. Now that's easy. That's pretty simple. Emotions sometimes are that way. But sometimes they're complex, like the check engine light comes on your car. Well, I don't know what that means because I'm not very good at those type of things. But that's where I'll need to get some help. But the light is just revealing that there's something deeper. And that's what Jay Adams was getting at. It's not an emotional problem. It's a pre-emotional problem. The emotions are kind of like the light on the dashboard. But the pre-emotions are the things that are happening underneath the surface. So I want you to think about that phrase as well. So this is a chart that I use with my counselees oftentimes, and I call it it's a core emotions chart. It's given to us by Relational Wisdom. It's a great chart, and what you'll see is the core emotions across the top: shame, sadness, shame, fear, enjoyment, love, surprise, disgust, and anger. Those are across the top, those 8 core emotions. And then along the left-hand side, you'll see low, medium, and high. Low, medium, and high intensities. So a low level of sadness would be disappointment, but a high level of sadness would be despair. A low level of fear would be concerned, but a high level of fear would be terrified. A low level of surprise would be a bemused state. A high level of surprise would be shocked. Do you see it? So what I will often do is I will ask people to take a copy of this and keep it in your journal. And as you journal and as you think about the event that you're gone through, you think about the feeling that you're having that are connected to that event. And you start to find out where those feelings are coming from. Now, some of us have habituated ourselves to one or more of these categories. So maybe you're the type of person that is a fear-based person, or an anger-based person, or a sadness-based person. And that's just wired into your tendencies of how you respond to life. So the event comes and you will see it through the lens of sadness. An event comes and you will see it through the lens of fear, or an event comes and you see it through the lens of anger. Perhaps you've habituated yourself that way. And the good thing about habituation is that you can dehabituate and rehabituate. You can stop bad habits and you can start new ones. And that's part of the process that we're going to try to work through. But let's continue with emotions. So what happens with emotions is that we can go through what we'll call a downward spiral of the emotions. They can hijack us and we can flood. So hijacking occurs when your emotions in your amygdala overpower your rational thinking in your neocortex. We'll see that in a moment. Flooding is the sense of feeling repeatedly swamped by your own emotions or others. And so now this hijacking and this flooding takes over, and it's just, I can't seem to stop. And so what happens is this. Now look at this chart of your brain. See, in high stress situations, emotions can overwhelm our rational thinking. As your emotions ramp up, your rational thinking tends to diminish. Now, if you look at the back part of the brain here by the brain stem, the spinal cord, that's where data comes into our brains. That's by your thalamus, and that's where you'll receive information like sights and sounds, touch, smells, taste, all of those things. And then what gets triggered is your amygdala. Your amygdala is going to decide whether it's going to fight or flight or freeze. It has to deal with this situation in one of those ways. And so what it has this tendency to do is to try to figure out which one is going to be best. Now your emotions are going to get triggered in your limbic system. You see, that happens in the middle part of your brain. You feel there. And now your emotions are triggered, one of those core emotions or the intensities of those core emotions. And then it continues all the way till you get to the frontal part of your brain. That's where you think, the neocortex. You think rationally up front. Well, the dilemma is that you can get triggered in the back part of your brain, and if you've habituated yourself to a certain way of feeling, you can feel that deeply before you can ever think rationally. I want you to think of a time where you lost control emotionally. And so when you've lost control, it's like you were just flying off with some type of emotion. And then it's like maybe minutes later, hours later, it's like, what in the world was I doing? How many people have ended up in jail because they have acted impulsively or acted out of emotion, and then they sit in jail and say, I can't believe I did that? How many people have lost jobs because they acted quickly and emotionally and erratically, and then later on regretted it? How many broken relationships, broken marriages, how many difficult situations have come because we've acted out of emotion without thinking truthfully and rationally? And so what happens is that we can have a trigger that can tend to happen in our lives. And this trigger is, these triggers we have absolutely no control over. We cannot control what comes at us. We can only control, as one author said, what comes out of us. And so now as we get triggered, if we tend to see things offensively, that, this is an offense, this is being done to me. Ken Sande in his book, The Peacemaker, talked about the fact that we could look at things happening by chance, or that it was a mistake, or that it was a divine assignment. See, if we believe that our lives are happening by chance, it should never have happened this way, then we're going to find ourselves feeling victimized time after time. But if we believe that God has sovereignly authored every moment of our lives, that there is not a molecule, as R.C. Sproul used to say, there's not even a maverick molecule in this universe. If we could look at triggers that way, I think we will stop this cycle. But if we don't, if we believe that triggers happen and that these things are coming at us, then we're going to take offense to them. And then when we take offense to them, which oftentimes happens, then what happens is that we tend to get defensive. And so now we are defensive because of what has just happened. We don't think that it's fair that this is happening this way. And so now what happens is that as you've gotten triggered, you find yourself getting offended. You will find yourself getting defensive. And then when you find yourself getting defensive, guess what happens now? You get angry. See, I'm an innocent victim, or I have a righteous indignation. I have a right to be angry because of the way you treated me. And so now I see myself as a victim. And so now as I see myself as a victim, I'm going to criticize you. I'm just going to rip you apart in my mind. And I may actually start to rip you apart out of my mouth. And so now I'm feeling critical of you. But then the emotions are ramping up and I'm starting to get confused and overwhelmed. And because I tend to believe a person that's in the midst of this type of struggle tends to believe that the problem is happening outside of them. You remember that diagram that we did before, event plus interpretation equal response? If they believe that the event is causing their response, they're going to feel hopeless because I can't control you. I can't stop you. I can't change you. And so now you get hopeless, but now you're going to get hardened towards this person. A hardness is going to come into your heart towards this person. Not a compassion, not a grace, not a love, not a mercy, not a kindness, not a patience, but hardness of heart. And that's going to lead to relational failure. I wonder if any of you have ever felt this way. Have you ever gone through a cycle like this? So many people do. And that's the reason for so many broken marriages and broken relationships and people leaving churches and leaving jobs day after day. And all the violence that we have in this world is a byproduct of this cycle. So what's the answer? How do I get out of this? Well, one of the ways that we can get out is to use a 4-step approach. And the 4-step approach starts with asking yourself 4 specific sets of questions. The first is, what am I feeling? And what we are called to do is this. We are called to look at the emotions that we're having and name them. And you remember that emotions chart, and I told you that I oftentimes ask my counselees to use that as they journal. It's so important to be able to name an emotion. Because what happens when you're naming an emotion, you're actually starting to think rationally. And you remember we said that as your emotions ramp up, your rational thinking diminishes. So now what we need to do is to get our thinking in the right direction and get our emotions in the right direction. And that's where the psalmist had said, "Why am I downcast, O my soul?" And the psalmist was trying to figure out, what am I feeling? And I was feeling downcast. Sometimes we feel fearful. Sometimes we feel sad. Sometimes we feel depressed, but we need to name it. And that leads to the second set of questions. Why am I feeling this way? You need to evaluate the source of your emotions. In Psalm 73, one of my favorite Psalms, the psalmist Asaph is recognizing that he had almost slipped into great despair and he had almost lost even a desire for ministry. He was actually a ministry leader, a worship leader in the church of his time. And he had become so downcast, but he said, here's the reason. He knew it. He was becoming downcast because he was looking at other people in the world and he was envying them. See, instead of looking outside of himself, he started to look within. He started to recognize that his great problem was within himself. That's what James was telling us, that when we are tempted, we can't be blaming God and we can't be blaming others, that it's because of the evil desires of our heart. So the first set of questions is, what am I feeling? The second set is, why am I feeling this way? The third set is, what will happen if I give in to these emotions? I want you to consider and anticipate what will happen. I want you to consider a person that I knew years ago who struggled with lust, this man, and he was on a business trip. And he had been invited to the room of a very attractive woman. Now, I don't know what her intentions were, but I clearly know that he struggled with lust, and this would have been a very difficult thing for him to do. He shouldn't have been there. And so what he could have done was he could have gone to the woman's room. He could have pursued a relationship with her where he should not have. But what he did was he reached out to a friend. He reached out to me and he said, hey, Doc, can you do me a favor? Can you talk? And if not, can you at least pray for me? And he recognized that if he gave into these emotions, he knew what the consequences were going to be. See, he started to think rationally about this, and he recognized that if I give into these emotions, this is not a really good thing to happen in my life. So oftentimes, and I'm sure all of us can look back at times where we did not think through and anticipate the consequences of following through on our emotions. And if we don't, we can find ourselves in great problems. And that's where, thankfully, the gospel of God's grace comes in and forgives us and frees us. So what am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? What will happen if I give into these emotions? And then the fourth thing is, how can I direct these emotions to express them in godly ways? Well, my friend did that, right? He reached out and he says, I need help. He reached out to a friend and he says, I need you to check me here because my emotions are ramping up. I need to think rationally. He could have prayed. He could have opened the Word. He could have gone for a walk. He could have done a myriad of other things and not gone to that person's room. So I want you to think through these series of questions. Ken Sande uses an acronym called READ, R-E-A-D. And if you can see it, look, R, recognize your emotions. That's the first set of questions. E, evaluate the source, second set of questions. The third set of questions, A, anticipate the consequences. And then finally, the last, D, direct them in constructive ways. So READ, recognize your emotions, evaluate the source, anticipate the consequences, and direct them in God-honoring ways. What in the world would happen if we all took these principles and tried to use them to deal with our emotional spirals in life? I think we would handle them better, and I think we would honor God and love others in a more, God-honoring way. So I pray that this will be a blessing to you.